Greetings, friends. Welcome back. This is the lecture that I've been anticipating for a very long time. We finally get to what I consider to be the most interesting topic of all that we'll talk about in this course, namely the art of rhetoric. Now, rhetoric is one of the most ancient studies. It goes way back to ancient Greece. But to set the mood, I wanted to read a speech to you written by a good friend of mine named William. And it goes something like this. Friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears. I come to bury Caesar, not to praise him. The evil that men do lives after them. The good is oft interred with their bones. So let it be with Caesar. The noble Brutus hath told you Caesar was ambitious, and if it were so, it was grievous fault. And grievously hath Caesar answered it. Here, under leave of Brutus and the rest, for Brutus is an honorable man, come I to speak in Caesar's funeral. He was my friend, faithful and just to me. But Brutus says he was ambitious, and Brutus is an honorable man. He hath brought many captives home to Rome, whose ransoms did the general coffers fill. Did this in Caesar seem ambitious? When that the poor hath cried, Caesar hath wept. Ambition should be made of sterner stuff. Yet Brutus says he wasn't ambitious, and Brutus is an honorable man. You all did see that on the Lupercal, I thrice presented him with a kingly crown, which he did thrice refuse. Was this ambition? Yet Brutus says he was ambitious, and sure, he's an honorable man. I speak not to disprove what Brutus says, but here I am to speak what I do know. You all did love him once, not without cause. What cause withholds you then to mourn for him? O judgment, thou art fled to brutish beasts, and men have lost their reason. Bear with me. My heart is in the coffin there with Caesar, and I must pause till it come back to me. Now that speech is probably one of the most famous in all of literature, English literature, modern literature, whatever you want to call it. This is an epic speech. And one of the reasons why it's so celebrated and remembered so well after all those years later is that it really embodies the art of rhetoric. Rhetoric is the study of persuasion. It's the art of taking a sentiment, a thought that you have, and being able to express it in such a way that makes it not only beautiful and memorable, but really moves people. Impacts them in a way that's just not possible with more matter-of-fact discourse. Now, rhetoric has a bad reputation nowadays. It's been called brainwashing. It's been likened to bullshit, meaningless ornamentation, taking a simple message and more or less decorating it with a lot of fancy words and phrases, just to make it seem fancier, more higher than it really needs to be. Now, that's not what we'll be concerned with here. I like the definition that the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle uses to define rhetoric, and it goes like this. Rhetoric is the ability to discover all available means of persuasion in a given situation. Now, there's a lot of key aspects to this definition. It doesn't necessarily mean that you win an argument. You could have a rhetorically sound argument that's may or may not move people, but it still could be very well constructed and very artistically done. Basically what rhetoric means is when you're confronted with a situation where you need to persuade somebody to do something, and you don't want to have to resort to violence, you need some kind of a way to be a little bit more persuasive. And that's where rhetoric comes in. It doesn't matter what the situation is. It could be someone has accused you of cheating or lying. It could be you're trying to sell a car. It could be that you're trying to talk your professor into a makeup test. Well, if you're a good rhetorician, then you know going into that situation that there are many different ways you could go about that process. Good rhetoricians know at least a couple dozen, maybe 100 different ways you could approach the situation. You're going to make a list of all those different ways or thinking about it, and then choose the one that seems to be the most likely to succeed. Rhetoric is the counterpart of something called dialectic. Dialectic is a very formal way of arguing, and it's if you take a logic class, you'll get into how dialectic works. But really, where rhetoric comes into play is when you can't just make a factual argument, where there's a matter of opinion, subjectivity. You need more than just the cold facts, scientific experiments or whatnot to make yourself persuasive. The history of rhetoric begins in ancient Greece. And it rises there because ancient Greece is where the first democracies arose. Now, in a democracy, you don't have a king or a tyrant who can just tell you what to do because, hey, I'm the king and you have to do it. In democracy, you have to actually make a speech and be persuasive and persuade the masses of people to vote your way. And that's going to call upon a lot of skills that you don't need if you are a king. Now, there were people that went from town to town in ancient Greece, and they were called the sophists. And the sophist's job was to train you to become a better speaker. You see, in ancient Greece, they didn't have lawyers or attorneys to argue your case for you. If your neighbor accused you of stealing one of his goats, then you had to go up in front of a huge jury of your fellow Athenians, perhaps, and try to make an argument as to why the neighbor was lying and why those really were your goats. Now, someone like Protagoras, Gorgias, or Isocrates could help you with this process, teach you how to be more persuasive so that you would have your way in court. A lot of us today are paranoid of public speaking. It's been said that people would rather be in the coffin than give the eulogy at a funeral, for example. So things were the same in ancient Greece. A lot of people were shy and nervous about getting up in front of this jury, and probably more so because so much was riding on it. So they were willing to pay these guys, these sophists, big bucks to train them in the art. Now, one was called Protagoras. He was from 481 to 420 BC, and he's known for saying, man is the measure of all things. Of things that are, that they are. Of things that they are not, that they are not. Now, this might seem strange to you, but it makes a certain amount of sense. Take, for example, a new movie. Let's say the new Star Trek movie that came out not too long ago. Or let's say Iron Man 3. Now, there are people that would argue with you that that movie was fantastic. They'd say it's a great movie, brilliant film. And somebody else would come along, though, and say that movie was crap. It was just a lot of special effects and action sequences, not a lot of depth to it. Nobody's going to be talking about it 5 years from now. Well, how do you know? How can you say for certain whether it was a good movie or not? And the fact is, you really can't. It's just opinion. You can back up the opinion with a lot of rhetoric, but it's still just an opinion. You could say, for example, well, it must be a good film because it grossed hundreds of millions of dollars at the box office. But again, that's still just opinion because the masses basically had the opinion that it was worth that money to buy the tickets and go to the theater. There was nothing, there was no scientific principle or law that made it that way. You know, compare that to gravity. It's not an opinion that if I, drop this little remote control here, then it's going to fall. That is a scientific and physical law. Doesn't matter if you think it should be another way, it's still going to fall. But where rhetoric comes into those situations where there is an ambiguity and you have to make an argument. So Protagoras was right on the money with this. Now Gorgias was another famous sophist, and he was often called the nihilist because he took the principle a little bit further. He said, for example, nothing exists. Well, you're looking around, you say, I think, this tablet exists, this glass of tea exists, this remote control exists. Well, it doesn't even matter if it exists, Gorgias would say, because even if it does, you really can't know anything about it. You could just be dreaming. You could be hallucinating. And many of us have seen optical illusions, for example, and have misremembered things. So perhaps he's onto something. And then he also adds on to that, you know, even if you could know something about it, you couldn't really communicate that to somebody else. You could try, but you've got no way of knowing, first of all, if the person has really and truly understood you. Many times you've probably communicated something and thought that you were clear, but the audience was confused. They took it the wrong way. Same with you. You might have thought you understood something, your teacher told you, but then when you took the test, you discovered you didn't really understand it at all. So Gorgias would say, there's no way you can ever know for sure if somebody has actually understood what you communicated. So basically what we're saying, we're trying to get away from this idea of an absolute truth. If something is absolutely true, like the Pythagorean theorem, a squared plus b squared equals c squared, that's going to be true for all right triangles no matter what. You're never going to find no matter how you play with the numbers, you're never going to find a right triangle that is not, that doesn't follow a Pythagorean theorem. On the other hand, an argument like it's better to wait until you're 30 or older to have children, there's no appeal to math that's going to prove that in a way that's going to be convincing to everyone. Now, Socrates was another one of these sophists, and he had his own school. It might sound familiar to you. You went for 4 years and got your degree. It combined the study of rhetoric with politics and ethics, and it was very practically oriented. Socrates wanted to train not philosophers who would go out and talk all day, but he wanted to train political leaders who would have an impact on his society. So what kind of methods did these sophists have? One of the most popular ones was called Topoi. And this is a type of argument template, basically. So you probably use templates and wizards in Microsoft Word, or played a game called Mad Libs. This was the same sort of thing. So there are lots of these little Topoi templates, and what you did, you memorized a bunch of them, and then when it was time to give your speech or to compose your speech, you would just plug in the details of the Topoi. So for example, here's one. If a quality does not in fact exist where it is more likely to exist, it clearly does not exist where it is less likely. So that's just one of these many templates. Now you could take this template and plug in some details. So let's say that you have come to me and you have said that you deserve an A in composition. So I could respond to that by using this template here. I could say, well, let's take a look at your grade sheet for all your classes. Well, it looks like you have in fact failed your physical education class. Now, if you can't even make an A in a class where almost everybody makes an A, then it's very unlikely that you would make an A in my class where very few students make A's. So you get the idea. So imagine if you had hundreds of those, maybe thousands of those templates memorized, and you could just trot them out anytime you needed to. You'd be very effective at argument. Now there were some conflicts with this, and not everybody liked the sophist. One of the big opponents was Plato. And he was concerned about this idea that there was no absolute truth out there, and that everything was more or less opinion. He thought this was just sort of laziness. You know, if you really want to know something, you study it, you talk about it enough, and eventually you'll find out the truth about the matter. He thought rhetoric was kind of like cookery or pastry making. You might think of one of the arguments he used is that I will update for make this a little bit more modern. So let's say you've got two kinds of food available to you. The item over here is a nice asparagus plate with some spinach. Some type of, it's got a lot of fiber in it. You know, it's high in vitamin content and all this kind of stuff. It tastes terrible, but it's very healthy for you. Now on the other side, I got this nice mini donut. It's delicious. You're going to love this thing. Now, Plato said that's kind of what rhetoric does. You know, you take the truth over here. Maybe it's not what you want to hear. Nobody, they say the truth can be painful. So maybe you would much rather go with the sophist who says, well, we're not going to worry about the truth, we're just going to believe what makes us feel better. And Plato had a big problem with that mentality. Now Aristotle, he thought rhetoric was just a tool. Like some people say a pistol, a handgun. Yes, you can take that handgun and you can go out there and you can murder people and commit crimes and felonies. Clearly that's evil. But you could also use that gun to protect your family. Police officers could use that gun to protect society from criminals. So it really doesn't, the gun itself is not good or evil, it's the person that uses it. So Aristotle said rhetoric was the same sort of deal. You could use rhetoric for positive ends. For example, you could use rhetoric to encourage people to live healthy lives. You could, instead of eating that mini donut, let's think about the long-term implications here. Let's think about your physical health. You want to be alive and healthy to take care of your kids and so on. So maybe you want to stay away from that mini donut. The donut is only going to be a few seconds of pleasure, but it's going to drag on with a lot of misery. And Aristotle would have approved of that use of rhetoric. Now Aristotle broke rhetoric into 3 types of appeals. So if you want to be persuasive, there's basically 3 ways to go about it. One, the most powerful, is pathos. And that is the appeal to the emotions and the feelings. So if you want to persuade somebody not to smoke, for example, you might try to make them feel guilty about smoking. You might make them afraid to smoke. You could show them pictures of people that have advanced stages of cancer, or maybe just to take them out to a graveyard and start pointing out all the tombstones that belong to people that died of lung cancer. And this might scare them into not smoking anymore. You could also try to make people angry, and that sometimes will move emotions. Now pathos appeals are very powerful, but they're not very intellectual. These are appealing basically to your base instincts. One of the most famous orators is also one of the most infamous orators, namely Adolf Hitler, said that really pathos is all you need. Don't worry about making any sense. Just keep on yelling, keep on shouting, keep it simple, keep people whipped up into a frenzy, and you'll be persuasive. Now, obviously, we want people to be a little bit more sophisticated than that, not just go running off with whatever sounds good. So that brings us to the next type of appeal called logos. Now this is the logical appeal. It's not the same thing as formal logic, but it's just trying to appeal to reason rather than brute emotion. You probably have seen people use statistics. They're quite popular. And the idea is, instead of just saying you should drive this car because I think it's great, you say you should drive this car because, well, for example, in traffic accidents, only 10% of the people that were driving this particular car had a fatality, whereas the other cars, maybe it was 20 or 30%. Or we could say you should buy this car because it's cheaper. You can save $2,000 or $3,000 with this car. It's going to get you from point A to point B just as well as the Porsche, and you'll have all that money to invest more wisely. So that's logos. Now finally there is ethos, and this is the credibility, your personal credibility, your reputation, your authority, your expertise. Basically, does the audience take you seriously? Do they believe that you are an expert on this topic? If you get onto an airplane, when you get onto your airplane, you look over to the left, and you'll see some pilots there and co-pilots. And chances are they'll be wearing a nice uniform and behaving in a professional manner. Probably, maybe they'll say hi, good morning, something like that, and they seem in control. Then basically, you look at these people and you think they seem to be qualified to be flying this plane. And then if you need further reassurance, then you can look up how they're trained, and they went through an extensive training simulation with all kinds of steps they had to take to be there flying that aircraft. Now, if you got onto the plane and there were some small children at in the cockpit flying the thing, you would be advised to exit immediately. Other examples of ethos are college degrees. The fact that I'm giving this lecture and have a PhD in the topic confers upon me a certain amount of automatic respect. Before I even open my mouth, just those degrees alone already build up some ethos, some credibility that, you know, maybe I know what I'm talking about. And it's the same thing for almost anything. If you violate ethos, then people won't trust you. If people don't trust you, then it doesn't matter how logical you are, it doesn't matter how well you use emotion. If people think you're lying or are probably lying, they're just not going to listen to you. Now, the Romans improved this system. They created 5 canons, what they called 5 canons of rhetoric. Invention, which is how do you come up with the arguments and claims, evidence. Arrangement, once you've got your evidence, how do you organize it? Style, so once you've got the evidence, how do you best articulate it? Basically what words should you use? Should you be very formal, very informal, crude, emotional, etc.? Memory. Okay, it's not going to be very persuasive if you go up on at the jury with a piece of paper and you're just reading from a script. It'd make be more persuasive if you actually had this memorized so that it seemed natural. And that natural is where we get into the final category of delivery, which is the actually giving the speech. So things like your hand gesturing, the pitch of your voice. Are you speaking in a dull monotone? All of these things were studied by the Romans. The Romans also had this concept of stasis, which is basically how to get to the heart of the actual debate. So you've got 2 people arguing about something. Let's say there's a murder trial. So you break into this mess and you're trying to sort out this whole business with the murder. So to get at the actual debate, where the members, the people talking, you're trying to figure out what exactly do they disagree about. So the stasis would start with the conjectural aspect, conjectural question, questions of fact. So did Smith kill Jones? Hey, there's Jones right there. Okay, he's obviously not dead, so we can stop this argument right here. It's factually incorrect. Now let's move on to something else. Okay, let's say though, okay, he is dead, and Smith did kill him. So then we move into the definitional. The question of definition, basically, how should this act be labeled? Was it murder or was it manslaughter? There's a big difference in how we treat those, right? If this was an accident, then we probably don't want to come down too hard on Smith. If it was cold-blooded murder that had been premeditated for months, then we're going to treat it differently. Okay, then we get to the qualitative. So we're gradually getting weaker, by the way. Qualitative is the quality of the act. So did Smith have a good reason to kill Jones? Maybe Jones was sleeping with his wife. It doesn't make it okay, but you know, people can sort of understand why that might lead to murder. Maybe, on the other hand, there was no reason. Maybe Smith just did it for fun, just did it for kicks. In which case, we're going to be a lot tougher on it. Or maybe did it for money, you know, even worse. Well, then we finally get to the translative, and that's the weakest of all, but sometimes the strongest of all. And that's where we get to questions of jurisdiction. So we know that he's guilty, so the only thing we have left basically is to look at the actual legal process and see if we can find some kind of loophole to get him off. So maybe when the investigators showed up on the scene, they messed up somehow, they made some errors, so now we have to throw the case out. Or maybe we could, you know, quibble with the jury selection, or, you know, who knows what. You know, if you watch legal shows, there are lots of ways around this. Okay, then throughout the Middle Ages, rhetoric became more associated with preaching, mostly because they had kings at that point. Remember what I told you. You don't need rhetoric if you've got a king. The king just says, do it, or I'm going to take your head off. There's no room for argument. But there was room for argument at the church. You needed to persuade people to follow religion, be faithful, to tithe, and so on. So there's a lot of rhetoric in that. And these rhetorical scholars began to apply rhetoric to the study of the Bible. There's a lot of areas or passages in the Bible that aren't necessarily clear. It's not necessarily easy to apply and find out, okay, there's been some kind of crime. Let's go to the Bible and find out what we should do. Sometimes it's clear, but a lot of the times there's a lot of room for debate about what the authors of the Bible actually mean. So a lot of scholarship grew up around this, interpreting the Bible. And they would come up with logical schemes like the syllogism. So here's a syllogism. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. So therefore, Socrates is mortal. So this was the ideal. It's kind of hard to argue with this. If you agree with the premises, the base, if you agree that all men are mortal and that Socrates is a man, then you have to believe, you have to go with that third line. Now obviously not all things are going to fit into this, and you can argue about the premises. Now Peter Ramus, he comes along in the 16th century in the Renaissance, and he separates out rhetoric from philosophy. So he thought philosophy is concerned with the facts, with what's true, and rhetoric is just about presenting that truth. So before there was a lot of intermingling. You use the same skills to make the speech as you would to arrange, to find the facts, to talk about, to collect the evidence. So Ramus wants to separate these things. And then Descartes, René Descartes, takes things even further from this. And he really focuses in on logic. He's known for saying, I think, therefore I am. So you see, he's going to disregard all evidence except for just very basic things that you can prove absolutely through pure logic. I think, therefore I must be here. You can't, how can you really argue with that? That's the only thing you can really know for certain, right? You know that you're at least, no matter what, this could all be a dream, could all be hallucination, we could be sophisticated robots, doesn't really matter, but if you're able to think about that, must mean you exist. The 17th century, we get to Francis Bacon, other scientific thinkers who began seeing rhetoric as not only separate from science, but actually hurtful to it, actually a negative thing. The idea was you should just state the facts, stick with the facts, be as clear as possible, don't try to sound fancy, don't use elaborate language, just keep it simple, keep it clear. Now unfortunately though, not everything is reducible to science, as we said before. A lot of ethics are not really, ethics are questions of right and wrong. Is it, for example, ethical to have a slave? You can't really go to the lab, get some chemicals together and prove this either way, right? You have to argue this using rhetoric to solve it. And so this stuff never did really, this idea that you don't need rhetoric just never was, it was impossible. You have to have rhetoric, and people finally realized that. And if you have to have it, it makes sense that you would have some training in it. Now, modern rhetoricians have evolved a lot further than this. There's people like Kenneth Burke who talk a lot about symbols, and there are people that study all manner of body language, gestures. There's people that study rhetoric very scientifically. They do set up sort of experiments. Marketing people, basically sales, all this sort of research is very similar to rhetoric. They want to find out, is this kind of advertisement better than this other type of advertisement? To do that, they do a lot of the same things that these ancient rhetoricians did. They think about the emotion of the argument, the logic, how much logic, how much emotion, how much detail. If you think about ethos and how important the corporate image is. The brand, the McDonald's brand, for example, took a lot of damage thanks to a documentary called Super Size Me, where the documentary basically slammed McDonald's, made it sound like eating there was very unhealthy, possibly even going to lead to an early death. So this is very damaging. So McDonald's had to respond to this attack. Now what can you learn from rhetoric? One is this thinking about an argument systematically. So if you have an essay that you want to write about why your teacher was such a great teacher, or why, I'll give you an example of a recent argument that came up in our department here at SCSU. The art department had 4 paintings, images, or drawings, I guess I should say, of various famous writers, and they wanted to give them to the English department to display in the building. Well, the arguments began about, should we follow through with that? Should we display these drawings? And one of the arguments was we shouldn't do that because they're all dead white men, and St. Cloud State's very committed to diversity. And it wouldn't send the right kind of image if we just had these 4 white guys. So they need to have, you know, some writers of color, some females, and so on. So let's just say that was the argument you wanted to make, that we need to have a more diversity in the portraits. So one thing is, you really want to think about what exactly is your claim? What exactly is the argument? What do you want? And we could say, well, what we actually want is 4 drawings, and we want each of the drawings to represent a different type of writer, let's say. Then the next thing is to start thinking about your evidence. What statements do you need to support that claim? What kind of evidence do you need for this? Well, again, you know, we could refer back to all the St. Cloud State material where they emphasize diversity. We could go outside that and show that maybe we could do a survey of students that are in the building and ask them, hey, would you like to have 4 white guys, or would you like to have a diversity in these drawings, and and see what they say. That could be another type of evidence. You might even fall back on some of these other, like the Pathos, and you could say, look, it's going to hurt people. Some students will be hurt by this and discouraged. Think about a student of color who all they see are these dead white guys, and that might discourage them, have any emotional impact on them. We obviously don't want that. So you get where I'm going with this, right? There's all those types of evidence you can bring out. Now, lastly, you need to think about how to connect the evidence that you've collected to the claim. Might not be obvious, and there's lots of ways to argue with the evidence. So, for example, coming back to the smoking argument, you say, for example, you shouldn't smoke because I got some studies here that show that people who smoke die of cancer. Okay, so let's say I wanted to argue against that. Well, I could say, let me take a look at those studies you just talked about. And then I take a look at the study, and I look at how the data was collected, and I say, what's kind of interesting about your study here is that all of the people that died of cancer were also morbidly obese. Coincidence? I think not. I think you might want to go back and think there might, was smoking really the only explanation for these cancer deaths? And good lawyers and attorneys and all kinds of rhetoricians over the years have used these kind of techniques. Okay, so basically that's rhetoric for you, kind of an introduction to the topic. And I want you to be thinking about it every time you sit down to write a paper. So for the Ideal Learning Experience project, for example, rhetoric's going to come into this. The pathos is going to be important because you need to move the reader. So if you're scared of the teacher, that needs to come across in the essay. If you were happy, that needs to come across in the paper. Same, basically the emotions are going to play a role. A lot of people say, for example, that good teachers show energy. They seem to be interested in the material. That's pathos. There will also be, of course, ethos. Now, you'll have an ethos as a writer. That's why it's important to pay attention to grammar and spelling. It's hard to, if I said, oh, I had the best English teacher in the world. I loved her. She was so effective. Man, me really learned a lot about English from her. I've instantly shot all my ethos with that. Obviously, I didn't learn very much English from her at all. And then logos, of course, you need to be thinking about evidence to support your claim that this was a good teacher. And you're going to have to think about some ways that you can prove that. Maybe by the fact that maybe it was a biology class, right? So before that class, you made C's and D's in science. After that, you made A's in all your other science classes. Pretty good evidence that she was an effective teacher. Later on, of course, when we get to the movie review, the same thing. When we get to the ethics paper, of course, there's going to be rhetoric. So basically, rhetoric is everywhere. All right, so I'll leave you with that thought. And also, I want you to be thinking about rhetoric in your everyday life. So today and for the next few days, be paying attention. Pay attention to television commercials and think about how they're trying to appeal to, how they're trying to persuade you. Look at billboards. Listen to your other teachers' lectures, and I guess mine as well, and try to figure out, how are they making themselves seem credible? How are they using logic? How are they using emotion? And same thing even when you're chatting with your friends and they try to persuade you to do something. Think about what kind of appeals they're using. Are they appealing to your emotions, to logic, to their own credibility and reputation? How are they doing that? And if you really start to study it and imitate great rhetoric, other rhetoricians, and you'll find yourself being a lot more persuasive.